The ancient stones of St. Mary Mead's parish church had witnessed many Christmas Eves, but none quite like this one. Snow had begun falling at tea time, dusting the Norman tower and settling in gentle drifts against the lych gate, where holly wreaths hung like dark green promises of warmth within. By 7 o'clock, when the evening service was to begin, the village had transformed into something from a Christmas card, all soft edges and golden windows glowing against the winter darkness. Miss Jane Marple made her careful way up the church path, her walking stick tapping against the flagstones with practiced precision. At 73, she had learned to navigate winter evenings with the same quiet attention she brought to most things, observing the placement of each step, noting the way the snow caught the light from the church windows, and registering, almost without conscious thought, the small details that others might miss. Tonight, she noticed that someone had been walking this path repeatedly throughout the day. The snow showed the compressed patterns of many footsteps, some quite recent, and one set that seemed to have been made by someone in considerable haste. Inside the church, the familiar Christmas Eve gathering was taking shape with the gentle efficiency that marked all village rituals. The Reverend Leonard Clement moved about his preparations with the mild distraction of a man whose mind was partially occupied with his sermon, while his wife Griselda arranged the last of the holly with her characteristic blend of reverence and irreverence. "I do think," Griselda was saying to Mrs. Price Ridley, "that holly looks rather fierce when one examines it closely. All those thorns like tiny daggers. Hardly the gentle spirit of Christmas, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Price Ridley, who took her Christmas decorations as seriously as her prayer book, pursed her lips in the manner of one who suspected frivolity but could not quite prove it. "The holly is traditional, Mrs. Clement. There are meanings in these old customs that perhaps we modern people don't fully appreciate." Miss Marple, settling herself in her accustomed pew halfway down the nave, smiled gently at this exchange. She had observed over the years that Christmas had a peculiar effect on people. It seemed to intensify whatever lay beneath their everyday facades, bringing out both the genuinely charitable and the merely sentimental in equal measure. The church was filling with the usual Christmas Eve congregation, augmented by several faces that appeared only on the most significant occasions. Colonel Melchett had arrived with his wife, both looking properly festive despite the colonel's obvious discomfort with his formal collar. Dr. Haydock bustled in, shaking snow from his coat and nodding to various parishioners with the easy manner of a man who had delivered half the village into the world. Mrs. Bantry swept in wearing what appeared to be an entire fur stole, followed by her husband, Arthur, who had the resigned expression of a man who had long ago learned not to question his wife's sartorial choices. But it was the newer residents who caught Miss Marple's particular attention. Mrs. Constance Blacklock, who had taken the lease on Little Paddocks only 3 months ago, sat alone near the back, her elegant profile turned toward the altar, with an expression that seemed more watchful than worshipful. Beside her, though not with her, sat Mr. Rudy Schurz, the young Swiss man who had recently taken employment at the Royal Spa Hotel. His presence at an Anglican service struck Miss Marple as interesting, particularly given his obvious unfamiliarity with the liturgy. Most intriguing of all was the small drama playing out in the front pews, where the Blackwood family had gathered for what Miss Marple suspected might be their last Christmas together. Old Mrs. Blackwood, the matriarch of the family that had owned the largest house in the village for 3 generations, sat ramrod straight despite her 87 years. Beside her, her grandson Edmund shifted restlessly, his eyes repeatedly moving to his watch, a gesture that his grandmother noted with visible disapproval. The family's financial difficulties were common knowledge in the village, though they were discussed only in the most delicate terms, as befitted a family that had once employed half the local population. The centerpiece of the evening service was to be the lighting of the Great Advent candle, a magnificent beeswax pillar that stood nearly 3 feet tall in its ornate brass holder beside the altar. It was a tradition that stretched back centuries, this candle that would burn throughout the Christmas season, its flame a symbol of hope and continuity. Horace Binns, the church warden, had spent considerable time that afternoon ensuring that everything was perfect, the wick properly trimmed, the brass polished to mirror brightness, the special long taper ready for the lighting ceremony. As the service began, Miss Marple found herself studying the candle with particular interest. There was something about its placement that struck her as slightly odd, though she could not immediately identify what troubled her. The brass holder sat at its usual angle, the candle itself appeared perfectly straight, and yet something seemed different from previous years. The service proceeded with the familiar rhythms of Christmas Eve, the lessons read in voices that carried both reverence and the slight nervousness that came with special occasions, the carols sung with varying degrees of musical accuracy, and the gentle homily from Reverend Clement about the light that came into darkness. It was during the third carol, as the congregation launched into "O Come All Ye Faithful" with particular enthusiasm, that Miss Marple noticed the first truly disturbing detail. Horace Binns, who should have been preparing for the candle-lighting ceremony, was nowhere to be seen. His absence was not immediately obvious to most of the congregation, but Miss Marple had observed him throughout the service, noting his increasing agitation as the evening progressed. She had seen him check his pocket watch repeatedly, whisper urgently to the verger, and finally slip out through the vestry door during the second lesson. When the time came for the lighting of the great candle, it was young Timothy Blackwood who stepped forward to perform the ceremony, explaining in a voice that carried just a touch too clearly that Mr. Binns had been suddenly taken ill. The explanation was accepted without question by most of the congregation, but Miss Marple noticed that old Mrs. Blackwood's expression grew distinctly troubled at her grandson's words. Timothy lit the taper with hands that trembled slightly, whether from nervousness or something else. Miss Marple could not determine. As he touched the flame to the great candle's wick, the beeswax caught immediately, burning with the steady, golden light that had marked Christmas Eve in St. Mary Mead for generations beyond counting. The congregation sighed with collective satisfaction, and the service moved toward its conclusion with the final blessing and the traditional recessional. It was as people began to file out, exchanging Christmas wishes and making plans for the morning service, that young Tommy Pierce came running up the church path, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Reverend Clement," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp night air, "you must come quickly. There's been a terrible accident at Mr. Binns's cottage. Mrs. Pierce sent me to fetch you. She says it looks like he's been overcome by the gas from his heater, and there's candles burning all around him, dozens of them, like some sort of shrine or something." The news spread through the departing congregation like ripples in a pond. Within minutes, a small procession had formed, led by Reverend Clement and Dr. Haydock, with various villagers following at a respectful distance. Miss Marple, despite Griselda's gentle protests about the cold and her age, insisted on accompanying the group. Horace Binns's cottage sat at the end of Church Lane, a neat little dwelling that reflected its owner's methodical nature in every detail, from the precisely trimmed hedge to the brass door-knocker that gleamed even in the dim street lighting. Tonight, however, something was distinctly wrong. Every window glowed with an unusual brightness, and the front door stood slightly ajar, releasing a steady stream of warm air into the winter night. Inside, the scene was both beautiful and deeply disturbing. Horace Binns sat in his favorite armchair before the fireplace, his head tilted back as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading. But surrounding him, on every available surface, were candles, dozens of them of every size and description, all burning with steady flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The effect was eerily beautiful, like a chapel prepared for some solemn ceremony. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the chair, his examination brief but thorough. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid poor Horace is dead," he announced quietly. "It appears to be gas poisoning. You can smell it quite clearly. The heater must have been faulty. But Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the doorway where she could observe without interfering, found herself troubled by several details that didn't quite fit the simple explanation of accidental death. The candles, for instance. They were arranged with a precision that seemed deliberate rather than random, and many of them had burned down to varying lengths, suggesting they had been lit at different times throughout the evening. More puzzling still was the fact that Horace Binns, a man obsessively careful about fire safety, would never have left so many candles burning unattended, particularly with a gas leak in the room. Most disturbing of all was the expression on the dead man's face. Rather than the peaceful look of someone who had simply drifted off to sleep, there was a tension around his eyes and mouth that suggested his final moments had been anything but tranquil. As Constable Polk arrived to take charge of the scene and Dr. Haydock began making arrangements for the removal of the body, Miss Marple quietly excused herself and made her way back to the church. The great Advent candle still burned in its brass holder, its flame steady and bright, a beacon of hope and continuity in a night that had suddenly become much darker. But as she stood there in the quiet sanctuary, Miss Marple found herself thinking not about hope and light, but about the peculiar human tendency to use the symbols of faith and celebration to mask the darkest of intentions. For she was quite certain that what they had witnessed at Horace Binns's cottage was not the tragic accident it appeared to be, but something far more sinister. A murder carefully planned and executed by someone who understood both the victim's habits and the village's Christmas traditions well enough to use them as the perfect cover for their crime. The candle that was meant to burn through Christmas had indeed illuminated something in the darkness, but it was not the gentle light of the season. Instead, it had revealed the cold, calculating mind of a killer who walked among them, hidden behind the familiar faces and Christmas wishes of St. Mary Mead. The pale light of Christmas morning found St. Mary Mead wrapped in that peculiar hush that follows any dramatic event in a small village. Miss Marple, who had slept fitfully, rose early and made her way to the kitchen window, where she stood watching the way the winter sun caught the undisturbed snow in her garden. Her mind kept returning to the scene in Horace Binns's cottage, not the official explanation of tragic accident, but the troubling details that seemed to whisper of something far more deliberate. By 8:30, the village was already humming with the kind of subdued excitement that tragedy brings to a quiet community. The news had traveled with remarkable speed through the network of early morning telephone calls and chance encounters at garden gates. Mrs. Price Ridley, collecting her morning paper at the post office, pronounced the incident a dreadful tragedy, of course, but entirely foreseeable. Poor Horace was always so terribly precise about everything. It's often the meticulous ones who overlook the obvious, isn't it? But Miss Marple found this explanation deeply unsatisfying. She had known Horace Binns for 15 years, and precision was indeed his defining characteristic. The idea that such a methodical man would light dozens of candles while suspecting a gas leak struck her as not merely unlikely, but impossible. When Griselda Clement appeared at her kitchen door shortly after 9, Miss Marple was ready with her own gentle inquiries. "I do hope you don't mind my calling so early, Jane," Griselda said, unwinding her scarf with characteristic efficiency. "But Leonard is quite beside himself about poor Mr. Binns. The thing is, I keep thinking about something I saw yesterday afternoon." Over tea by the kitchen fire, Griselda revealed that she had encountered Horace around 3 o'clock, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone over his garden fence. He looked rather upset, actually, and there was a motor car parked just around the corner, a rather expensive one, dark blue or black. We don't often see such cars on Church Lane. This detail caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. But before she could pursue it further, Mrs. Bantry arrived in a flurry of fur and agitation. "My dear Jane, I simply cannot accept this accident theory. All those candles arranged so precisely. It was like something from a magazine photograph. If poor Horace had been overcome by gas, surely he would have collapsed where he stood. not arranged himself so neatly in his chair. The three women were soon joined by Dr. Haydock, who had stopped by on his morning rounds. His professional demeanor carried an undertone of puzzlement that he seemed reluctant to voice directly. "The coroner will certainly rule it accidental death," he said carefully, warming his hands around his teacup. The gas smell was unmistakable, but there were small things. His dinner was laid but untouched, and his spectacles were placed lens up on the table, not lens down as he invariably did. Small things, perhaps, but Miss Marple absorbed these details with the quiet attention she brought to all potentially significant information. "Small things often tell the largest truths," she murmured. "Did you happen to notice the candles themselves, Doctor? Were they all of the same type?" Dr. Haydock frowned thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, they weren't. Some were clearly church candles, good beeswax, but others appeared to be ordinary household tapers. Red and green ones, actually. Quite festive. Rather an odd mixture for private devotions." This observation sent Miss Marple's thoughts racing back to the church service, where she had noticed something peculiar about the great Advent candle's placement. She excused herself and made her way to St. Mary's, where she found the verger sweeping the nave with unusual vigor, the kind of energetic cleaning that often follows emotional distress. "Terrible business about Mr. Binns," she said gently. "He was so particular about everything being just right for the service." The verger paused in his sweeping. "That he was, Miss Marple. Fretted something dreadful about moving the Advent candle to the older brass holder. Said it had a wobble and he didn't want wax on the carpet. But when I arrived for evening service, it had already been changed. Never did find out who moved it." Miss Marple examined the candle holder carefully, noting the faint smear of wax on the inner rim and a tiny mark on the snuffer that suggested recent, perhaps inexperienced use. Someone had indeed been practicing with the church candles, and that someone had taken considerable care to ensure their actions appeared routine and unremarkable. As she walked slowly back through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. A mysterious visitor, expensive motor cars on quiet lanes, candles purchased and carefully arranged, and a death staged to look like the most natural of accidents. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead harbored someone with both the intelligence and the ruthlessness to plan murder, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain that Horace Binns had not died by accident, but had been deliberately killed by someone who understood both his habits and the village's Christmas traditions well enough to use them as the perfect disguise for their crime. The pale winter light of Christmas morning found St. Mary Mead wrapped in that peculiar atmosphere that follows any dramatic event in a small community, a mixture of hushed reverence and barely contained curiosity. Miss Marple, who had risen early despite her restless night, found herself drawn repeatedly to her kitchen window, not for the peaceful view of her snow-covered garden, but for the activity she could observe along Church Lane, where a steady trickle of villagers had been passing Horace Binns's cottage since dawn. The Christmas morning service was notably thinner than usual, and those who did attend sang the familiar carols with a restraint that seemed to acknowledge the shadow cast over their celebration. Miss Marple took her accustomed place, noting how conversations died as she approached and resumed in whispers once she had passed. The human tendency to find excitement even in tragedy was as predictable as it was uncomfortable. After the service, as the congregation gathered in small clusters outside the church, Miss Marple allowed herself to drift within, hearing of the various theories being proposed. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let dramatic possibilities go unexplored, was holding forth near the Lich Gate. "I always said that gas heater was dangerous. Poor Horace was so methodical about everything else, but gas can be treacherous, silent as death itself. All those candles, well, people do develop odd habits when they live alone." But it was young Timothy Blackwood who provided the first genuinely significant revelation. Miss Marple encountered him walking slowly past her gate. his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets and his face bearing the troubled expression of someone wrestling with an uncomfortable realization. "Timothy, my dear," she called gently, timing her emergence from her garden to appear casual. "How thoughtful of you to step in last evening when Mr. Binns was taken ill. The lighting of the Advent candle is such an important tradition." The young man startled visibly, his pale face flushing with what appeared to be more than simple embarrassment. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, well, someone had to do it, didn't they? The thing is, I keep wondering if I should have looked for him more thoroughly. Perhaps if I had found him earlier." Miss Marple studied his expression with the careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate piece of needlework. "You went looking for him, then? How very responsible of you. When he didn't appear for the candle lighting, I thought perhaps he was having difficulty with the arrangements. I walked round to his cottage around 6:30. The lights were on. Every window seemed to be glowing, actually. I knocked, but there was no answer. I assumed he had simply lost track of time." This detail struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. If Timothy's account was accurate, the cottage had been brilliantly illuminated well before the official discovery of the body, suggesting that the elaborate candle arrangement had been in place for hours before Horace Binns had supposedly succumbed to gas poisoning. Her next stop was the ironmonger's shop, where Mr. Peake was arranging his limited post-Christmas inventory. "I wonder," she said, admiring a display of household items, "whether many people have been buying candles recently. Red and green ones, perhaps, for the season." Mr. Peake brightened with the pleasure of sharing local intelligence. "Oh, quite a few, Miss Marple. Had a lady in Monday, very particular about wanting red tapers all the same length. Wore good gloves with a tear at the thumb, kept turning that hand away, she did. Paid in cash and seemed in rather a hurry." After leaving the shop, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Griselda Clement sorting through the morning's correspondence with unusual vigor, the kind of energetic activity that often follows emotional distress. "Griselda, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I hope the service wasn't too difficult this morning. Such a shock about poor Mr. Binns." "The dreadful thing is," Griselda replied, looking up with troubled eyes, "I can't stop thinking about those church keys. Leonard checked the vestry cupboard this morning. They're simply not there. Horace never gave them to anyone else, and they weren't found on his person." This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that someone had deliberately gained access to the church to practice with the candle-lighting ceremony. The missing keys, combined with Timothy's observation about the cottage being lit hours before the body was discovered, painted a picture of careful premeditation rather than tragic accident. As she walked slowly back through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Someone had purchased candles in advance, obtained access to the church for practice, and carefully staged Horace Binns's death to appear accidental. The methodical nature of the crime suggested not a moment of passion, but cold, calculated murder by someone who understood both the victim's habits and the village's Christmas traditions well enough to use them as the perfect disguise for their deadly intentions. The peaceful streets of St. Mary Mead harbored a killer of considerable intelligence and ruthlessness, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain that the truth, like the light of those carefully arranged candles, would eventually illuminate the darkness that had claimed Horace Binns's life. The afternoon light of Christmas Day was already beginning to fade when Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Pierce, whose cottage shared a garden fence with poor Horace Binns's residence. The proximity that had made Mrs. Pierce the first to discover the tragedy also meant she had been ideally positioned to observe the unusual events of Christmas Eve. Miss Marple found her neighbor eager to share what she had witnessed, though clearly troubled by the implications of her observations. "I've been thinking about it all morning," Mrs. Pierce confided as she led Miss Marple into her sitting room, where the curtains remained partially drawn as if to shield them from the view of the cottage next door. "The more I remember, the stranger it all seems. You see, Mr. Binns was such a creature of habit. 2 lamps in the evening, never more, and his curtains drawn precisely at sunset. But Christmas Eve, every window was blazing with light from 5:30 onward. Mrs. Pierce settled into her chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver testimony of considerable importance. I heard voices around 5:15, Mr. Binns sounding quite agitated, saying something like, "No, I don't hold with it," and a woman's voice, very smooth and persuasive. I didn't see her arrive, but there was a motor car earlier, dark and expensive-looking, that pulled up near the corner and then drove off again when the snow began falling more heavily. The detail about the mysterious visitor aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicion that Horace's death had been far from accidental. "And the candles?" she inquired gently. "That's what troubles me most," Mrs. Pierce replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "When I looked across around 6 o'clock, they were burning even as soldiers in formation, all the same height. It was beautiful, but unnatural somehow. Mr. Binns would never have lit so many candles at once. And there's something else I discovered this morning when I was tidying the dustbin area. 2 red candle ends that weren't mine. Proper Christmas tapers lying among the refuse. Tommy suggested he might have mixed up the bins, but I know my own household waste." Miss Marple's visit was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose brisk efficiency and obvious impatience with village speculation made him a formidable presence in Mrs. Pierce's modest sitting-room. He had come, he announced, to inform the neighborhood that the case was essentially closed. "Accidental death by gas poisoning," he stated with the satisfaction of a man who preferred straightforward explanations. "Dr. Haydock has confirmed it, and the coroner will undoubtedly concur. We do have one complicating factor, a property dispute between the deceased and Mr. Silas Croft, who had made some rather heated threats recently. We'll be questioning Croft, naturally, but the physical evidence points clearly to accident." Miss Marple listened with her characteristic mild attention, though she found Inspector Slack's theory deeply unsatisfying. Silas Croft, for all his bluster and quick temper, was hardly the type to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. The careful staging of the candles, the missing church keys, the practiced arrangement, these suggested a mind far more subtle and calculating than Croft possessed. Her afternoon inquiries revealed additional disturbing details. A conversation with old Mrs. Blackwood disclosed that Timothy had been selling portions of his valuable stamp collection, with Horace Binns serving as both appraiser and intermediary with London collectors. The financial relationship between the elderly church warden and the young man facing family bankruptcy added a compelling dimension to Timothy's obvious distress about the death. Most intriguing was her encounter with Mrs. Constance Blacklock outside the chemist's shop, where the elegant newcomer displayed an oddly detailed knowledge of the church's Christmas traditions for someone who had arrived in the village only 3 months earlier. When young Rudy Schurz approached with brass key he claimed she had dropped, the careful choreography of their interaction suggested a relationship far deeper than casual acquaintance. As evening approached and Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the accumulating evidence. The killer had indeed been clever, weaving their crime into the familiar fabric of village Christmas celebrations. But human nature, she had observed over many years, rarely managed to sustain perfect deception indefinitely. The torn glove with its telltale wax stains, the financial pressures driving desperate measures, the missing keys and practiced candle arrangements, each detail was a thread that, when pulled carefully, would eventually unravel the entire elaborate construction of lies and misdirection that had claimed Horace Binns's life. The crisp Boxing Day morning found St. Mary Mead wrapped in that peculiar stillness that follows both celebration and tragedy. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning over the accumulating details in her mind, rose early with the uncomfortable certainty that she was witnessing not accident, but carefully orchestrated murder. The methodical staging of Horace Binns's death, the missing church keys, the practiced arrangement of candles, all pointed to a killer of considerable intelligence who understood village routines well enough to exploit them. Her morning walk took her first to the Royal Spa Hotel, where the lobby carried the lingering sense of Christmas festivities and furniture polish. Rudy Schertz appeared from the dining room, his ready smile faltering slightly when he recognized her. Miss Marple had observed that strangers rarely remained strangers long in St. Mary Mead, and young Rudy's careful English occasionally revealed traces of something distinctly German rather than Swiss. "You were most kind to Mrs. Blacklock yesterday," she observed mildly, returning her brass key. "Such things can be terribly difficult to replace." "I only found it in the street," Rudy replied, setting down his tray with hands that bore, Miss Marple noticed, a faint waxy residue along one cuff. "Outside the chemist's shop. It looked important, so naturally I returned it." The explanation struck her as oddly rehearsed, particularly given his obvious familiarity with Mrs. Blacklock. When Miss Marple inquired gently about his movements on Christmas Eve, Rudy claimed to have been working private parties at the hotel, though his account of cycling to the village around 5 o'clock to deliver menus seemed unnecessarily detailed for such a routine errand. Her encounter with Mrs. Blacklock outside the post office proved even more illuminating. The elegant woman's kidskin gloves showed a careful mend at the right thumb, exactly matching Mr. Peake's description of his mysterious customer who had purchased red tapers with such particular specifications. When Mrs. Blacklock's key ring slipped during their conversation, Miss Marple glimpsed a long-shanked brass key among the ordinary Yale patterns, one that Mrs. Blacklock quickly concealed while explaining it as merely a cupboard key for the house's odd little storage spaces. The morning's most disturbing revelation came through young Timothy Blackwood, whom Miss Marple encountered near the church looking haggard and guilt-ridden. His explanation for returning sheet music to the vestry seemed elaborate for such a simple task, and when she mentioned his stamp-collecting relationship with Horace Binns, Timothy's denial carried the brittle quality of someone trying to convince himself as much as his listener. "We weren't particularly close," Timothy insisted, though his trembling hands and averted gaze suggested otherwise. The financial pressures facing the Blackwood family were well known, and Miss Marple recalled Dr. Haydick's mention that Horace had been serving as intermediary with London collectors for valuable stamps. Inspector Slack's arrival at her cottage that afternoon brought news of Silas Croft's interrogation, delivered with the satisfaction of a man who preferred straightforward explanations. "Threats, temper, quarrels over land," Slack announced confidently. "The coroner's report won't contradict accidental death, but Croft had motive enough for murder." Miss Marple listened with her characteristic patience, though she found the theory deeply unsatisfying. Silas Croft, for all his bluster, was hardly capable of the sophisticated deception they had witnessed. The careful staging of candles, the missing church keys, the practiced arrangements, these suggested a mind far more calculating than Croft's crude temperament could sustain. Her afternoon reconnaissance past little paddocks revealed a dark blue motor car in the drive, expensive and discreet, matching Mrs. Pierce's description of the vehicles seen near Horace's cottage on Christmas Eve. The substantial property, with its well-maintained grounds, suggested resources far beyond what a simple tenant might possess, raising questions about Mrs. Blacklock's true circumstances and intentions. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern. Someone had practiced extensively with church candles, purchased specific supplies while attempting to remain anonymous, and orchestrated Horace Binns's death with the precision of a stage production. The killer walked among them, hidden behind familiar faces and Christmas courtesies, but human nature, she had observed, rarely sustained perfect deception indefinitely. The waxy residue on a cuff, the mended glove, the mysterious brass key, each detail was a thread that, when pulled carefully, would eventually unravel the entire elaborate construction of lies that had claimed an innocent man's life. The third day after Christmas brought a subtle shift to St. Mary Mead's atmosphere, as if the initial shock of tragedy was giving way to a more complex understanding of what Horace Binns's death might truly signify. Miss Marple, making her customary morning rounds, observed how conversations ceased abruptly when certain individuals approached, and how glances lingered with new speculation on faces that had seemed entirely familiar just days before. Her first significant discovery came through the church vestry, where the verger's distress over missing inventory provided concrete evidence of premeditation. Horace Binns had maintained meticulous records of all church supplies, and his ledger showed a clear entry dated December 23rd. 1 box beeswax pillar tapers, 12, received, checked. Yet no corresponding entry marked their use, and when the verger opened the cupboard that morning, the entire box had vanished. More telling still were the physical traces left behind. A faint crescent of soot on the snuffer cap where inexperienced hands had tilted it over flames, and a small flake of red wax on the rush mat that the verger quickly swept away while chattering about decorations and needlework guilds. Miss Marple recognized these details for what they were: evidence that someone had mixed church stock with purchased festive tapers and practiced extensively to ensure the perfect effect. Her morning was further illuminated by Mrs. Bantry's arrival, bearing intelligence that transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the financial pressures surrounding the case. "Arthur has been making inquiries," she announced with characteristic dramatic flair, "and it seems poor Horace wasn't merely handling Timothy's stamp sales. He was actually advancing considerable sums against future transactions. The Blackwood family debts are far more serious than anyone realized, and Horace held detailed records of every arrangement." The implications struck Miss Marple immediately. If Horace had been serving as both appraiser and creditor, his death would eliminate not only substantial debt, but also the most knowledgeable witness to the true value of the stamps involved. Timothy's obvious distress took on a far more sinister aspect when viewed through this lens of financial desperation. Her investigation received official weight through an unexpected visit from Colonel Melchett, whose formal demeanor carried undertones of personal concern. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I wonder if I might impose upon your local knowledge. This business with Horace Binns, Inspector Slack remains convinced of either accident or Silas Croft's involvement, but there are forensic details that don't quite align with either theory." Over tea in her sitting room, Colonel Melchett revealed information that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The post-mortem had disclosed that Horace had consumed a substantial quantity of brandy shortly before his death. Remarkable for a man known to be virtually teetotal. More significantly, his evening meal had been laid out precisely at 6 o'clock, according to his usual habit, but remained completely untouched, suggesting death had occurred earlier than the staged scene indicated. The afternoon brought the most revealing development yet when Miss Marple encountered Timothy Blackwood near the church, his haggard appearance and guilt-ridden manner finally compelling him to confess what had truly transpired on Christmas Eve. "I did go to see him," Timothy burst out, the words tumbling as though they had been held back too long. Not long after 6 o'clock. The cottage was blazing with light in every window, far brighter than Mr. Binns would ever maintain. I knocked repeatedly, but received no answer. I lost my nerve, thinking he might be cross about my having shown the stamp to someone else. I left a note pushed through the gate, but it wasn't there when Tommy Pierce found the body. This revelation provided crucial timeline evidence, confirming that the elaborate candle arrangement had been in place well before any plausible accidental death could have occurred. The missing note suggested someone had been carefully managing the scene to eliminate inconvenient evidence. Miss Marple's encounter with Mrs. Blacklock outside the post office that afternoon proved equally illuminating. The elegant woman displayed unusual interest in the investigation's progress, asking detailed questions about Inspector Slack's theories with the kind of careful attention that suggested more than casual curiosity. When Miss Marple mentioned the missing church inventory, Mrs. Blacklock's response carried a telling undercurrent. How unfortunate that such careful records can disappear so easily. It makes one wonder what other documentation might prove, unreliable. The metaphorical weight of her words was not lost on Miss Marple, who recognized in them the voice of someone who understood precisely how carefully constructed deceptions might unravel. As evening approached and she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence of a crime far more sophisticated than Inspector Slack's straightforward theories could accommodate. The killer had orchestrated not merely murder, but an elaborate performance designed to achieve multiple objectives while misdirecting official attention. The elimination of substantial debt, the acquisition of valuable stamps, the destruction of inconvenient financial records, all wrapped in the familiar rituals of Christmas celebration, and presented as tragic accident. Yet the very sophistication of the crime was becoming its greatest weakness, as each elaborate detail created new opportunities for detection by someone willing to look beyond the obvious explanations and recognize the darker truths that human nature invariably betrayed through small, telling inconsistencies. The fourth morning after Christmas dawned with the hoarfrost lacing the hedges like fine crochet, transforming St. Mary Mead into a crystalline tableau that seemed to mock the darkness lurking beneath its peaceful surface. Miss Marple received an early telephone call from Colonel Melchett, whose formal courtesy carried undertones of genuine concern about forensic details that continued to trouble him despite Inspector Slack's confident pronouncements. "I've had another look at poor Horace's cottage," the Colonel explained. "And there are small things that don't align with simple accident. Dr. Haydock mentioned finding 2 glasses by the brandy decanter, though Horace was known to be virtually teetotal. More significantly, there are faint impressions on his desk blotter that might interest you." Miss Marple arrived at the cottage within the hour, where the lingering scent of beeswax seemed to whisper of elaborate deceptions. Tilting the blotter toward the thin winter light, she could discern the ghostly impressions left by pressure from papers written elsewhere. The letters black, the figure 28, and most tellingly, the word tapers. Someone had used Horace's desk to write notes about candles, leaving behind an inadvertent record of their planning. Her subsequent visit to the chemist's shop provided another crucial piece of evidence. Mr. Bowden remembered clearly the well-dressed woman who had purchased brandy 3 days before Christmas, claiming it was needed with clove oil for toothache, an old remedy that provided perfect cover for acquiring spirits. The customer had worn expensive kidskin gloves with a distinctive mend at the right thumb and had insisted on carrying the parcel herself, declining the shop's usual delivery service. The morning's most significant revelation came through young Tommy Pierce, who approached Miss Marple with the nervous excitement of someone finally ready to share a troubling secret. "Mr. Rudy gave me a shilling, not to mention the long box on his bicycle Christmas Eve," the boy confessed. "Said it was fireworks, but it smelled like the church candles Mr. Peake sells." "Fireworks don't smell of beeswax, do they, Miss Marple?" This testimony confirmed the connection between Rudy's shares and the missing church supplies, suggesting coordination between supposed strangers that went far beyond casual acquaintance. When Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Blacklock later that morning, the elegant woman's composure showed subtle but telling cracks under the mounting pressure of maintaining her elaborate deception. During their conversation about local customs, Mrs. Blacklock displayed curiously specific knowledge about stamp collecting, mentioning that everybody knows the penny black has white borders, a detail that struck Miss Marple as oddly rehearsed for someone claiming no particular expertise in philatelic matters. The observation suggested familiarity with valuable stamps that contradicted her professed ignorance of Timothy's collection. Dr. Haydock's afternoon visit provided crucial medical context that transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's execution. Horace suffered from a mild heart condition, the doctor explained, and was particularly careful about avoiding alcohol due to his medication. The quantity of brandy in his system would have been enough to incapacitate him quickly, especially given his abstinence and small frame. The implications were chilling. Horace had been deliberately rendered helpless before the gas was introduced, explaining how someone could arrange the elaborate candle display while he sat unconscious in his chair. The untouched dinner, laid out precisely at 6 o'clock according to his invariable habit, confirmed that the attack had occurred shortly after his evening preparations began. Mrs. Gribble at the baker's shop provided additional intelligence about Mrs. Blacklock's increasingly suspicious behavior. "Always pays in cash, never uses checks like proper residents," she observed, "and I saw her having quite a heated discussion with that Swiss boy behind the hotel yesterday. Something about money and timing. He looked terribly distressed." As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence of a crime far more sophisticated than Inspector Slack's theories could accommodate. The blotter impressions, the brandy purchase, the coordinated candle acquisition, the medical incapacitation, each element revealed careful planning by someone who understood both Horace's habits and the village's Christmas traditions well enough to exploit them. The killer had orchestrated not merely murder, but an elaborate performance designed to eliminate a dangerous witness while acquiring valuable assets. Yet the very sophistication of their deception was creating the evidence trail that would ultimately expose them. Human nature, Miss Marple had long observed, rarely sustained perfect lies indefinitely, and the cracks in this particular construction were becoming impossible to ignore. The 5th morning after Christmas brought a subtle shift in St. Mary Mead's atmosphere, as if the initial shock of tragedy was crystallizing into something more purposeful and dangerous. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night considering the accumulating evidence, rose with the uncomfortable certainty that time was becoming a critical factor. The elaborate deception surrounding Horace Binns's death was beginning to unravel, and she suspected the perpetrators were preparing to conclude their business and disappear. Her morning began with an unexpected visit from Timothy Blackwood, whose haggard appearance and trembling hands spoke of sleepless nights and mounting guilt. The young man's carefully maintained composure finally cracked as he sat in her parlor, revealing details that transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's true scope. "I must tell someone," Timothy burst out, his voice carrying the brittle quality of someone approaching complete emotional collapse. "The stamp collection. It wasn't just about selling it to pay debts. Mrs. Blacklock convinced me to let her examine the most valuable pieces, claiming expertise in authentication. She said London collectors required proper documentation, and that Mr. Binns, for all his local knowledge, lacked the sophisticated contacts needed for truly valuable sales." Miss Marple listened with her characteristic patience, recognizing in Timothy's confession the outline of a scheme far more elaborate than simple murder for financial gain. She visited Mr. Binns twice that week. Timothy continued, always carrying a leather portfolio and staying for extended periods. The second time, she brought that Swiss fellow, Rudy, introducing him as a courier from a London auction house. I thought it all very professional and reassuring. The coordination between Mrs. Blacklock and Rudy's shirts was becoming clearer, their supposed casual acquaintance revealed as an elaborate performance designed to conceal their true partnership in fraud. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the post office provided additional confirmation when she learned that Mrs. Blacklock had been receiving correspondence from London auction houses, always under professional letterhead that suggested established business relationships. Her afternoon reconnaissance took her to Little Paddocks, where she found Mrs. Blacklock arranging flowers with the kind of methodical precision that Miss Marple had come to associate with minds capable of elaborate planning. The elegant woman received her with gracious courtesy, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain beneath the polished surface, a slight tremor in her hands when arranging the stems, and eyes that seemed to assess rather than simply acknowledge her visitor. "Such a lovely arrangement," Miss Marple observed, settling into the offered chair with her knitting. "Horace Binns would have appreciated the attention to detail. He was always so particular about precision. In his church duties, his record-keeping, even his evening routines." Dr. Haydock mentioned finding his dinner laid out exactly at 6 o'clock, though completely untouched, rather unusual for someone who maintained such regular habits. Mrs. Blacklock's response carried just a hint of too careful casualness. Poor man. One never knows what small disruptions might affect elderly people's appetites. Perhaps he was simply feeling unwell. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she continued her gentle probe. Indeed, though Mr. Bowden at the chemist's mentioned something rather interesting, a lady purchasing brandy just before Christmas, claiming it was needed for an old toothache remedy. Such traditional cures are becoming quite rare, aren't they? The lady wore distinctive kidskin gloves with a mend at the thumb. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight stiffening of posture, a barely perceptible pause before Mrs. Blacklock replied with studied lightness. How observant of Mr. Bowden to notice such details. Village chemists do see all manner of requests, don't they? But it was Miss Marple's next observation that produced the most telling response. Colonel Melchett mentioned finding rather curious impressions on poor Horace's desk blotter, faint traces of writing that seemed to spell black and the number 28, along with the word tapers. Quite mysterious, really, since Horace was always so careful about his correspondence. Mrs. Blacklock's hand, resting on the arm of her chair, clenched almost imperceptibly, and a faint flush rose to her cheeks. Her eyes, though still attempting composure, held a fleeting shadow of genuine alarm before being quickly masked by renewed pleasantness. "A blotter," she repeated, her voice carrying a note of forced curiosity. "How very peculiar. I can't imagine what such scribblings might signify." Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes meeting Mrs. Blacklock's with quiet understanding. "No, one would hardly expect such things from someone so methodical. Yet sometimes the smallest details tell the most complete stories, don't you think?" As Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the subtle but unmistakable signs of guilt she had witnessed. Mrs. Blacklock's carefully maintained facade was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of accumulated evidence and psychological questioning. The elaborate scheme, combining stamp fraud with murder to eliminate the one witness capable of exposing the deception, was approaching its final stages, but so too was Miss Marple's patient unraveling of the truth that would bring the perpetrators to justice. The candle that had burned through Christmas had indeed illuminated more than its creators intended, revealing not only their crime but the methodical intelligence behind it. Yet that same intelligence, Miss Marple suspected, would soon prove to be their ultimate downfall, as the very precision that had made their deception possible would also provide the evidence needed to expose their guilt. The 6th morning after Christmas broke with a sharp, crystalline clarity that seemed to cut through the lingering shadows of deception in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, who had spent much of the night considering the accumulating threads of evidence, rose with the uncomfortable certainty that events were approaching their inevitable conclusion. The elaborate construction of lies surrounding Horace Binns's death was beginning to collapse under its own weight, and she sensed that desperate measures might soon follow. Her morning began with an unexpected telephone call from Griselda Clement, whose usually cheerful voice carried undertones of genuine alarm. "Jane, dear, I'm afraid something rather disturbing has happened at the vicarage. Leonard discovered evidence of an intruder in his study. Papers scattered, drawers searched, and most peculiarly, a red candle stub melted to a saucer on his desk. The room smells of paraffin and something medicinal, and there's a small pane in the side window that's been carefully removed and replaced." Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage within the hour, where the lingering scent of burnt wax and the faint metallic smell of fear seemed to whisper of desperate attempts at concealment. The study showed clear signs of methodical searching. Not the random destruction of common burglary, but the careful work of someone seeking specific documents. Most telling was the red candle stub, its wick neatly trimmed in a manner that spoke of practiced hands and the faint smear of what appeared to be dried blood on the window frame. They were looking for something particular, Miss Marple observed, examining the scene with her characteristic attention to detail. The searching was too systematic for mere theft, and the candle suggests someone working by limited light to avoid detection. Dr. Haydock's arrival brought additional disturbing intelligence. "I've been making inquiries about our Mrs. Blacklock," he announced, his professional demeanor carrying undertones of genuine concern. "It seems she's been asking about travel arrangements to the continent, claiming urgent family business. Given recent events, I thought you should know immediately." The implications struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity. The elaborate deception was reaching its critical phase, with the perpetrators preparing to conclude their business and disappear before their fraud could be fully exposed. The break-in at the vicarage suggested they were seeking to recover or destroy evidence that could link them to their crimes. Her subsequent encounter with Timothy Blackwood near the church provided the final piece of the puzzle. The young man, his face haggard with guilt and sleepless nights, finally revealed the full scope of his involvement in the scheme that had claimed Horace Binns's life. "Mrs. Blacklock convinced me she was helping," Timothy confessed, his voice carrying the brittle quality of someone approaching complete emotional collapse. "She said London collectors required proper authentication and that Mr. Binns, for all his local knowledge, lacked the sophisticated contacts needed for truly valuable sales. She brought documentation, references from auction houses, even that Swiss fellow as a supposed courier. It all seemed so professional and legitimate." Miss Marple listened with patient attention, recognizing in Timothy's words the outline of a scheme far more elaborate than simple theft. "She examined your most valuable stamps personally," she observed gently. "Yes, claiming expertise in authentication. But now I realize she was making detailed notes, probably arranging for reproductions to be created. When Mr. Binns began asking too many questions about the London buyers and examining the stamps too carefully, she said complications had arisen that required alternative solutions." The confession confirmed Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime. Mrs. Blacklock, whose elegant exterior concealed the calculating mind of a professional fraudster, had recognized that Horace Binns's expertise posed an insurmountable threat to their elaborate deception. The staging of his death, the brandy to incapacitate him, the gas to provide the apparent cause, the candles to suggest accident or ritual, had been designed to eliminate the one witness capable of exposing their fraud. As afternoon approached, Miss Marple made her way to Little Paddocks, where she found Mrs. Blacklock arranging flowers with the kind of methodical precision that had once seemed merely elegant, but now appeared ominous in its calculation. The woman's composure remained intact, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain beneath the polished surface, a slight tremor in her hands, eyes that seemed to assess rather than simply acknowledge. "Such beautiful arrangements," Miss Marple observed, settling into the offered chair with her knitting. Poor Horace would have appreciated such attention to detail. He was always so particular about precision, in his church duties, his record-keeping, even his evening routines. Rather like yourself, I imagine, in matters requiring careful planning. Mrs. Blacklock's response carried just a hint of too careful casualness. "One does develop habits of organization over time, Miss Marple. It becomes second nature, really." Indeed, though sometimes even the most careful plans encounter unexpected complications. Village life can be so unpredictable, with people noticing the smallest details. Torn gloves, unusual purchases, late-night activities. Such things have a way of accumulating into rather complete pictures, don't they? The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Blacklock's composure showed the finest of cracks, her eyes holding a fleeting shadow of genuine alarm before being quickly masked by renewed pleasantness. Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes meeting Mrs. Blacklock's with quiet understanding. As she made her way home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the final confirmation of guilt she had witnessed. The time for patient observation was drawing to a close, and she sensed that the next 24 hours would bring the dramatic conclusion that such elaborate deceptions inevitably demanded. The candle that had burned through Christmas was about to illuminate its final secret, revealing not only the identity of the killers, but the cold calculation that had transformed seasonal celebration into the perfect cover for fraud and murder. The 7th morning after Christmas arrived shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to muffle St. Mary Mead in cotton wool, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions of themselves. Miss Marple, who had spent the night in careful consideration of how best to bring her investigation to its necessary conclusion, knew that the time for gentle observation had passed. The elaborate deception surrounding Horace Binns's death was entering its final phase, and she sensed that without immediate action, the perpetrators would slip away like shadows in the morning mist. Her first telephone call was to Colonel Melchett, delivered with the quiet authority that had served her well in previous investigations. "Colonel, I believe we must act today. There are matters that require immediate attention, and I fear our suspects are preparing to leave the village permanently." By 10 o'clock, a carefully orchestrated plan was in motion. Miss Marple had extended an invitation to tea, ostensibly to discuss a small charity initiative for the coming year. The pretext was deliberately thin, but Mrs. Blacklock, ever keen to maintain her elegant facade, had accepted with polite alacrity. Timothy Blackwood and Rudy Schurz were also invited, their presence crucial for what Miss Marple intended to be the final act of this Christmas tragedy. The fog pressed against the windows of Miss Marple's sitting room as her guests assembled that afternoon. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows that lent an almost theatrical quality to the proceedings. Mrs. Blacklock arrived first, elegant as ever in her dark coat and carefully mended kidskin gloves, radiating the artificial calm of someone operating under considerable strain. Rudy Schurz followed, his usual ready smile replaced by nervous energy that manifested in restless hands and darting glances. Timothy Blackwood came last, pale and hollow-eyed, clutching his hat as though it might anchor him against the storm he sensed approaching. Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, discussing the severity of the fog and its implications for travel, noting almost casually that such weather made departure from the village quite challenging. Then, with the subtle shift in tone that those who knew her had learned to recognize, she steered the conversation toward the tragedy that still cast its shadow over their community. "Poor Horace Binns," she murmured, stirring her tea with deliberate precision. "Such a methodical man. It troubles me still, thinking of someone so careful about details meeting such an apparently careless end. The police, dear Inspector Slack, seem satisfied with their theories of accident or simple motive, but human nature, I find, is rarely so straightforward." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the warm air, watching their faces with those deceptively innocent blue eyes that missed nothing. Rudy Schurz shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a faint sheen of perspiration appearing on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. Mrs. Blacklock's grip on her teacup tightened almost imperceptibly, though her expression remained composed. "Take the candles, for instance," Miss Marple continued, reaching into her knitting bag and withdrawing a small red taper. So many of them in poor Horace's cottage, and such an interesting mixture. Church candles, proper beeswax, mingled with festive red tapers like this one. It would require someone with rather particular access to acquire church supplies, wouldn't it? And then to know precisely how to arrange them for maximum effect. She held up the candle, examining it in the firelight. "Mr. Peake at the ironmonger's has such a good memory for customers. He mentioned a lady who purchased red tapers just before Christmas, very particular about wanting them all the same length. She wore kidskin gloves with a distinctive mend at the thumb." Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly to Mrs. Blacklock's hands, which were now clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Blacklock offered a carefully modulated laugh. "Village shopkeepers do tend to embellish their memories, don't they, Miss Marple? Mr. Peake is a dear man, but hardly reliable for such specific details. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded mildly, though there are other curious details that seem to support his recollection. The church keys, for instance, missing from their usual place and never found on poor Horace's person. And then there was that unfortunate break-in at the vicarage where someone searched so methodically through Leonard's papers. Not looking for valuables, clearly, but for documents. They even left a red candle stub behind, melted to a saucer on his desk. Timothy Blackwood made a small, involuntary sound, his teacup rattling against its saucer. His eyes, when they finally met Miss Marple's, held the desperate look of someone who had been carrying an unbearable burden. The most interesting discovery, Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm, came from Colonel Melchett's examination of Horace's cottage. You see, he found impressions on the desk blotter, faint traces of writing that had been done elsewhere but left their mark. The letters black were quite clear, along with the number 28 and the word tapers. Rather specific planning notes, one might think. She looked up from her knitting with that gentle smile that had unnerved more than one guilty conscience. Of course, the most telling detail was Horace's expertise in philatelic matters. Such knowledge can be quite inconvenient when one is attempting to authenticate valuable stamps, particularly when the authentication involves, shall we say, creative interpretation of provenance. Mrs. Blacklock's composure showed its first real crack, a slight tremor passing across her features before being quickly suppressed. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple. My assistance to young Timothy was purely neighborly." "Indeed? How interesting, then, that you should have corrected me so precisely about penny blacks being imperforate rather than perforated. Such specific knowledge for someone with merely neighborly interest." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the silk now. "And Rudy, my dear boy, you've been rubbing at your cuff again. Beeswax is terribly persistent, isn't it? Particularly when one has been practicing with church candles to ensure a perfect arrangement." The young man's hand froze, then slowly withdrew from his pocket, revealing the telltale waxy residue that had marked him from the beginning. Something metallic clinked as he moved, and a brass key, long-shanked and unmistakably ecclesiastical, fell to the carpet with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. At that moment, Colonel Melchett stepped quietly into the room from the kitchen where he had been waiting with Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock. The official presence transformed the atmosphere immediately, lending weight to Miss Marple's gentle accusations. "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that we've reached the point where pretense becomes more difficult than truth. You see, the difficulty with carefully orchestrated performances is that they must be sustained perfectly, and human nature rarely manages such consistency. Horace Binns was murdered, not by accident or simple violence, but by an elaborate scheme designed to eliminate the one person whose expertise threatened to expose a sophisticated fraud." Mrs. Blacklock's elegant mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You understand nothing of the pressures involved," she said, her voice sharp with desperation and fury. "Horace was going to ruin everything with his endless questions and examinations. The old fool couldn't leave well enough alone." The confession that followed came in fragments, each revelation building upon the last, as the elaborate construction of lies collapsed under its own weight. Mrs. Blacklock, whose real name was Constance Cummings, had been operating a sophisticated stamp fraud across several counties, using forged credentials and manufactured provenance to sell high-quality reproductions as authentic rarities. Horace Binns's growing suspicion and expert knowledge had threatened to expose their entire operation. The murder had been meticulously planned to appear accidental while eliminating the dangerous witness. The brandy, purchased under the pretext of an old remedy, had been used to render Horace unconscious. The gas leak had provided the apparent cause of death, while the elaborate candle arrangement, practiced using stolen church supplies, had been designed to suggest either accident or some form of private devotion gone wrong. As Inspector Slack moved to make the arrests, Miss Marple reflected on the human capacity to transform symbols of hope and celebration into instruments of deception. The Christmas candles that should have represented light conquering darkness had been perverted into tools of murder, their warm glow concealing the coldest of calculations. Yet truth, like candlelight, had a way of illuminating even the most carefully constructed shadows. The great Advent candle still burned in St. Mary's Church, its steady flame a reminder that justice, however delayed, would eventually shine forth to expose the darkness that had claimed Horace Binns's life in what should have been the season of peace and goodwill among all people. The fog was beginning to lift as the police led their prisoners away, and Miss Marple could see the familiar outlines of her village emerging once more from the mist. Changed by tragedy, perhaps, but enduring in its essential character, as human communities always did when truth finally conquered deception. The fog had completely lifted by evening, revealing St. Mary Mead in the clear, cold light of a winter sunset that painted the church spire gold against the darkening sky. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she reflected on the events that had transformed what should have been a season of celebration into something far darker and more complex. The arrests had proceeded with the quiet efficiency that marked all official business in their small village. Mrs. Blacklock, or rather Constance Cummings, as Inspector Slack had revealed her true name to be, had maintained her composure even as the handcuffs clicked into place, though her eyes had held the bitter fury of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in a single afternoon. Rudy's shirts had broken down completely, his youth and inexperience no match for the weight of complicity in murder, while Timothy Blackwood had seemed almost relieved to have the terrible burden of his knowledge finally lifted from his shoulders. The true scope of the fraud had emerged during the subsequent investigation. Constance Cummings had been operating across 3 counties, using forged credentials and manufactured provenance documents to sell high-quality reproductions as authentic Victorian rarities. The mysterious Black 28 notation found on Horace's blotter referred to a specific stamp in Timothy's collection, a rare penny black from 1840, catalogued as number 28 in Horace's meticulous records. The plan had been to replace the genuine article with a sophisticated forgery after Horace's death, using his posthumous reputation to authenticate the false provenance. Dr. Haydock had stopped by as the village processed the shocking revelations, his professional manner carrying undertones of both satisfaction and regret. "A nasty business," he observed, settling into his accustomed chair. "Though I must say, Jane, your reconstruction of the crime was remarkably complete. The brandy to render poor Horace unconscious, the gas to provide the apparent cause of death, and those candles arranged with such theatrical precision. It was all designed to misdirect attention from the real motive." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers continuing their steady work. The difficulty with elaborate deceptions is that they require so many supporting elements. Each detail creates another opportunity for observation, another thread that might be pulled to unravel the entire construction. Human nature, I've found, rarely sustains perfect lies indefinitely. Timothy's involvement had been largely unwitting, his desperate financial circumstances making him vulnerable to their sophisticated manipulation. Yet his relief at the truth's emergence suggested that guilt had been consuming him far more effectively than any legal punishment might have done. The Blackwood family's mounting debts would require other solutions, but Timothy seemed to have recovered some of his natural resilience now that he was free from unwitting complicity in fraud. As the days passed, the village slowly processed the revelation that murder had walked among them disguised as elegant sophistication and neighborly assistance. Mrs. Pierce felt vindicated by her observations of the mysterious motor car and the candle ends in her dustbin. Mr. Peake recounted his description of the lady with mended gloves with renewed authority. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, for all her initial pronouncements of accidental death, now claimed she had always had a feeling about Mrs. Blacklock. Griselda Clement's visit brought news of the village's gradual return to normalcy, though with an underlying awareness that their peaceful community had been touched by something genuinely sinister. "Leonard is planning a special service," she announced. "Something about light conquering darkness and truth emerging from deception. Rather appropriate, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her blue eyes holding that quiet satisfaction that came from seeing justice properly served. "Indeed, though I suspect poor Horace would have appreciated the restoration of proper order more than any theological interpretation. He was always so particular about things being exactly as they should be." The great Advent candle continued to burn in St. Mary's Church, its steady flame a reminder that some traditions endured despite human attempts to corrupt them. Miss Marple had visited the church that morning, standing quietly before the altar where the familiar ritual of Christmas Eve had been transformed into something so much darker. Yet the candle burned on, its light unchanged by the evil that had briefly surrounded it. As she sat by her fire that final evening, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar satisfaction that came from seeing truth emerge from deception, justice from injustice, and light from darkness. The candle that had burned through Christmas had indeed illuminated more than its creators intended, revealing not only their crime but the enduring power of careful observation and patient understanding to expose even the most sophisticated attempts at deception. Horace Binns could rest peacefully now, his murder avenged and his reputation for meticulous attention to detail vindicated by the very precision that had ultimately exposed his killers. The great Advent candle would burn until 12th night, its steady flame a beacon of hope and continuity in a world where darkness sometimes masqueraded as light. But Miss Marple knew that true illumination came not from candles, however beautiful, but from the patient application of human wisdom to the eternal struggle between truth and falsehood, justice and corruption, good and evil. In that struggle, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, good had once again prevailed, and St. Mary Mead could return to its peaceful slumber, secure in the knowledge that watchful eyes and understanding hearts stood guard against those who would disturb its tranquility.